"Why?" she whispered, her voice rough from 18 months of silence. "Why would you want a woman like me?" The stranger looked at her through the bars of the iron cage. "Because I see a human being, not a beast." He'd just paid $500 in gold to buy her freedom from a corrupt sheriff. Now their real journey begins. The iron cage sat in the center of Willow Creek's main square like a monument to cruelty. July sun beat down on the metal bars until they shimmered with heat. Inside, a woman sat motionless on a rough wooden bench, her wrists bound by loose chains that served no purpose except humiliation. The chains weren't meant to hold her. Everyone knew that. They were meant to remind the crowd that she was dangerous, a beast, a killer. The sign nailed to the bars said it all in crooked black letters. The Giant Widow. $1 to look, $10 to touch. Eleanor Brennan was 28 years old. She sat with her back straight, despite everything. Despite the months in this cage, despite the heat that made the air shimmer like water. Her blonde hair hung in dull strands around a face that had once been softer, prettier, before grief and captivity carved new lines into it. She was tall, unusually tall for a woman 6 feet and 1 inch of height, that had made her a curiosity even before the cage. Her shoulders were broad from years of hard labor. Her hands resting in her lap were large and calloused like a man's hands. Strong hands. Killer's hands, the townspeople whispered. She didn't look at the crowd. She kept her pale blue eyes fixed on a worn patch of dirt near her boots, the same patch she'd been staring at for 18 months. 548 days. She'd counted every single one. The crowd pressed close to the bars. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders, pointing and laughing. Women clutched their shawls and whispered behind gloved hands, their voices sharp with righteousness. Young men shoved each other forward, daring one another to get closer to touch the monster, their nervous laughter too loud in the afternoon heat. Sheriff Vernon Blackwood sat at a small wooden table beside the cage, his thick fingers stacking coins into neat piles. Sweat darkened his shirt under the arms and across his broad belly. His badge sat crooked on his vest, tarnished and dull. He smiled at every paying customer, his teeth yellow, his eyes bright with greed. $340 in 2 weeks. Not bad for a widow nobody wanted. Better than his salary. Much better. A boy of maybe 8 years old bent down and grabbed a rock from the dirt. He wound up his arm and threw it hard at the bars. The stone clanged against the metal with a sharp ringing sound that made several women gasp. The crowd roared with laughter and approval, pushing the boy forward like he'd done something brave, something heroic. Eleanor didn't blink. Her hands didn't move. She gave them nothing. No reaction, no fear, no anger. And somehow that made their cruelty worse. They wanted her to flinch, to cry, to beg. But she'd learned long ago that feeling nothing hurt less than feeling everything. The afternoon stretched on. More coins clinked into Sheriff Blackwood's collection. More children threw stones. More men paid their $10 to reach through the bars and touch her hair, her shoulder treating her like livestock at auction. Eleanor sat through it all with the stillness of carved stone. She'd perfected this emptiness, this distance from her own body. It was the only way to survive. She thought about Thomas. She always thought about Thomas when it got bad. Thomas Brennan, her husband, dead 2 years now. He'd been a carpenter, gentle and kind, with clever hands that could coax beauty from rough wood. He'd never once made her feel too tall, too strong, too different. He'd called her his oak tree. Strong and beautiful, he'd said. When he died of consumption, she'd nursed him for 6 weeks, watching him waste away to nothing, while the town stayed far away, afraid of the sickness, afraid of her. She'd dug his grave herself when it was over. The ground had been frozen hard. She'd worked for 12 hours straight, her hands bleeding her back, screaming until the hole was deep enough. Nobody came to help. Nobody came to the funeral. Just her and the winter wind and a simple wooden cross. 4 months after she buried Thomas, 3 drunk men had cornered her in the alley behind the saloon where she worked, washing dishes to pay off his debts. Wade Cutler, Bert Mason, Jack Reeves. Their names were burned into her memory like brands. They'd seen a tall widow with no man to protect her and decided she was fair game. They'd grabbed her, torn her dress. Wade had wrapped his hands around her throat and squeezed while Bert held her legs and Jack laughed, his breath hot and sour with whiskey. She'd begged them to stop. They hadn't listened. Wade had leaned close to her ear and whispered what they were going to do to her, how they'd make sure she couldn't talk about it after. That's when something inside Eleanor had broken. Or maybe it had awakened. She'd stopped begging. She'd fought. When it was over, all three men lay dead in the alley. Wade's skull cracked against the brick wall. Bert with his own knife in his belly, his wrist twisted at an angle that shouldn't have been possible. Jack face down in the dirt, his neck broken from the fall when she'd chased him down and thrown him to the ground. She'd stood over their bodies covered in their blood, and her own shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Sheriff Blackwood had found her there, still standing, still shaking, and he'd arrested her without asking a single question about the torn dress, the bruises on her throat, the terror in her eyes. The trial had been brief. The town council had debated for less than an hour. Hang her or cage her. In the end, greed had won out over justice. A dead woman brought no profit. But a caged monster, that was something people would pay to see. So here she sat, the giant widow, the beast in the square, a warning to other women about what happened when you stepped outside your place, when you were too strong, too different, too unwilling to die quietly. A shadow fell across her boots. Eleanor didn't look up. She'd learned not to look up. Looking up meant making eye contact, and eye contact encouraged them to speak to her, to poke at her with words the way children poked at her with sticks. But this shadow didn't move. It stayed there, blocking the sun, silent. Against her will, Eleanor felt her gaze lift from the dirt. Just a fraction. Just enough to see the boots. Worn leather, good quality, covered in trail dust. Not town boots. Traveler's boots. Her eyes traveled up. Dusty coat, broad shoulders, a hat that had seen better days, and then finally a face. A man's face, weathered and rough with several days of stubble, his jaw tight. His eyes were gray like winter sky, and they were looking at her. Not at the cage, not at the sign. At her, at Eleanor, like she was a person instead of a thing. Something stirred in her chest. Something she'd buried so deep she'd thought it was dead. Recognition, not of his face. She'd never seen this man before. But recognition of the thing she saw behind his eyes. Pain. The kind of pain that matched her own. The man's hands tightened on the brim of his hat. His throat worked like he was trying to swallow something down. Around them the crowd continued its noise, but it seemed distant now, muted. All Eleanor could hear was her own heartbeat and the sound of this stranger's breathing. He opened his mouth like he might speak, then closed it again. His eyes never left hers. She saw anger flicker across his features as he took in the bruises on her wrists from the chains, the hollow shadows under her eyes, the careful way she held herself so still. He saw her, actually saw her, and that was somehow more terrifying than all the months of being invisible. "Hey, mister," Sheriff Blackwood's voice shattered the moment. "You want to touch the giant widow, $10. Good price for a once-in-a-lifetime experience." The stranger's jaw clenched harder. He turned his head slowly to look at the sheriff, and there was something in that movement, that cold precision, that made the sheriff's smile falter. "How much?" the stranger asked. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. Blackwood's smile returned wider now. "Like I said, $10 to touch. $1 just to look, but seeing as you're already looking, no." The stranger's eyes went back to Eleanor. "How much to buy her?" The square went silent. It happened so fast, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the world. Conversation stopped mid-word. Children stopped squirming. Even the flies hovering over the horse trough seemed to pause in their buzzing. Eleanor's eyes widened. Her hand so carefully still for so long trembled in her lap. Sheriff Blackwood let out a short, nervous laugh. "She ain't for sale, mister. She's serving her sentence. Town council decided. She's public property now, you might say." The stranger took a step toward the sheriff's table. "Everything has a price, Sheriff." He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. When he opened it and poured the contents onto the table, gold coins spilled out in a glittering cascade. $20 gold pieces, 30 of them, $600 in total. More money than most families in Willow Creek would see in 5 years. The crowd pressed closer, eyes wide and hungry at the sight of so much wealth. Sheriff Blackwood stared at the pile of gold. Eleanor could see his mind working, see the calculations happening behind his greedy eyes. $600. The cage had earned him $340 in 2 weeks, but that income wouldn't last forever. Eventually people would get bored. Eventually the novelty would wear off. But $600 right now in his hand, that was real. That was certain. And besides, keeping Eleanor locked up was becoming a problem. Some folks were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about whether it was legal, about whether she'd gotten a fair trial. Doc Wilson had been making noises about testifying to what he'd seen the night she was arrested. $500, Blackwood said abruptly. $500 and she's yours, but you take responsibility for her. Anything she does, any killing, any trouble, it's on your head. The stranger didn't haggle, didn't even blink. He counted out $500 in gold with steady hands and pushed it across the table. Deal. Blackwood snatched up the coin so fast his chair scraped backward. She's your problem now. His hands shook as he fumbled with the ring of keys at his belt, his fingers clumsy with greed and relief. The stranger turned back to Eleanor. He didn't smile, didn't make any sudden moves. He just walked slowly to the cage and knelt down in the dirt so his face was level with hers through the bars. The crowd surged forward, hungry for whatever would happen next. Eleanor watched him kneel. This man who'd just spent a fortune to buy a stranger. A killer. A monster. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the scar on his left cheek, the way his hands resting on his knees trembled just slightly. He was afraid too. Not of her, of something else. Something he carried with him. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. Her throat was dry. She'd barely spoken in 18 months. Her voice came out rough and low, scraping against vocal cords that had forgotten how to shape words. "Eleanor. Eleanor Brennan." He nodded once. "I'm Daniel. Daniel Hartley." Then he did something that shocked her more than anything else in this entire surreal scene. He reached into his vest pocket and drew out a ring. A simple gold band, old but carefully polished, worn smooth by time. He held it in his palm so she could see it, so the whole town could see it gleaming in the afternoon sun. And there on his knees in the dirt before the cage, with all of Willow Creek watching and whispering and gasping, Daniel Hartley asked Eleanor Brennan to marry him. The world stopped turning. Eleanor's heart, which had been beating so carefully, so quietly for so long, suddenly hammered against her ribs like it was trying to escape. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Around them the crowd erupted. Women screamed. Men cursed and laughed in equal measure. Children started crying, confused by the adult chaos. The whole square surged toward the cage like a wave crashing against rocks. But in the middle of all that noise, all that motion, Eleanor's voice found itself. One word, barely a whisper. So quiet Daniel had to lean closer to the bars to hear it. "Why?" Daniel stayed on one knee. He didn't smile, didn't perform for the crowd. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, meant only for her. "Because no human being should be locked in a cage like an animal. Because I know what it feels like to want to disappear from the world. Because I stood by 2 graves 3 years ago and begged God to let me die with them, and He didn't, so I've been walking around dead ever since." He paused. "When I rode into this town and saw you in this cage, I saw myself. A person being punished for surviving when they should have died." Eleanor stared at him, searching his face for the trick, for the trap. Men had laughed at her before, made sport of her pain, used her tears for entertainment. But all she saw in Daniel Hartley's gray eyes was exhaustion, grief, and something that looked dangerously like hope. Behind them, Sheriff Blackwood finished counting his gold and grabbed his ring of keys. "Eleanor Brennan," he announced loudly, playing to the crowd one last time. "You now belong to Daniel Hartley. That's that." He thrust the key into the lock before anyone could object, before the town could change its mind, before he had to give the money back. But the town had plenty of objections. A man shoved forward through the crowd, his leather apron streaked with soot, his face burning red with rage. Henry Cutler, the blacksmith, Wade Cutler's older brother. "That woman murdered my brother." Henry's voice cracked with fury. He jabbed a thick finger toward Eleanor. "She deserves a rope, not a husband. This is an outrage. This is against God and nature." The crowd roared its agreement. Several people shouted for the sheriff to stop, to arrest Daniel for interfering with justice, to hang Eleanor right here, right now, and be done with it. Eleanor lifted her head. For 18 months, she'd sat silent while others told her story for her, while they called her monster beast killer freak. She'd let them have their version because fighting back had only ever made things worse. But something about Daniel kneeling in the dirt with his grandmother's ring in his hand, something about the way he'd said he saw himself in her, gave her the courage to speak. Her voice cut through the noise, not loud, but clear, strong, the voice of someone who'd decided she had nothing left to lose. "I didn't murder anyone." The crowd's roar died to a murmur. People strained to hear. Eleanor Brennan, the silent giant widow, was speaking. "Your brother and 2 other men cornered me in an alley behind the saloon. It was after midnight. I'd just finished washing dishes. I was tired. I wanted to go home." She paused. "They grabbed me. Wade put his hands around my throat and squeezed. Bert held my legs. Jack tore my dress. They said things, terrible things, about my dead husband, about what they were going to do to me, about how they'd make sure I couldn't talk about it when they were done." Henry Cutler's face went purple. "You lying—" "Ask Doc Wilson," Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength. "Ask him what he saw when the sheriff dragged me into his office that night. Ask about the bruises on my throat, the torn dress, the blood under my fingernails. Ask him whose blood it was." For a moment eyes shifted, turned toward Doc Wilson, who stood near the back of the crowd. The old doctor's face was pale. He looked at the ground. Sheriff Blackwood snapped his fingers. "Enough. The town council already decided. What's done is done." He didn't want anyone thinking too hard about that night. Didn't want questions about why he hadn't investigated. Didn't want to explain why 3 men's word against 1 woman's had been enough to cage her without a real trial. He had $500 in gold now. Time to end this before someone demanded their money back. He jabbed the key into the lock and turned it hard. The heavy mechanism clicked with a sound Eleanor had heard 1,000 times. Every morning when they unlocked it to throw in her breakfast. Every evening when they locked it again for the night. But this time the sound meant something different. This time it meant freedom. Sheriff Blackwood yanked the door open and hurried back to his table, scooping his gold into his pockets with shaking hands. The door swung wide on rusted hinges. Eleanor stared at it. The first time in 18 months that door had been open when she was inside. The first time she could walk out instead of being dragged in. Slowly, carefully she stood. Her legs trembled. She'd spent so many months sitting, standing only when they told her to, pacing the small space like a caged animal. Her full height always surprised people. 6 feet 1 inch. Taller than most men in Willow Creek. Taller than seemed natural for a woman. As she unfolded to her full height, the nearest people in the crowd actually stepped back. Involuntary. Instinctive. Fear. Eleanor stepped through the open door. The bars didn't touch her. The chains fell away. She stood on the wooden platform outside the cage in the sun, free. Her legs nearly gave out. Daniel stood and moved toward her, but he didn't grab her, didn't try to steady her by force. He simply held out his hand, palm up, the way a gentleman might offer his hand to a lady stepping down from a carriage. A gesture of respect. Of choice. Eleanor looked at his hand, rough and calloused like hers, strong, but trembling slightly. He was afraid too, afraid she'd refuse, afraid of what he'd just done, afraid of the crowd and the chaos and the commitment he'd just made to a woman he didn't know. After a long breath, she placed her palm in his. Her hand was nearly as large as his, rough and strong and scarred, The hand of someone who'd worked hard all her life. The hand that had killed 3 men. But when Daniel's fingers closed gently around hers, he didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He just helped her down from the platform until they stood side by side in the dust of the square, the empty cage behind them, half the town staring like they were watching an execution. "I don't understand," Eleanor said, her voice low and broken. "Why would you want a woman like me? I'm a killer, a freak, the monster of Willow Creek." Each word tasted like rust and shame. She'd heard them so many times they felt like truth. Daniel's answer was quiet, meant just for her. "I see a woman who fought back when 3 men tried to break her. I see someone who was punished for being stronger than the cowards who attacked her. I see a human being underneath the hurt, not a beast." That last word hit her harder than any stone the children had thrown. Human being. When was the last time someone had called her that? When was the last time anyone had looked at her and seen a person? "I killed them," she whispered. "With my bare hands. I felt their bones break. I heard them die." "They tried to rape you," Daniel said simply. "You survived. That's not murder. That's courage." Around them the crowd's shouts were getting louder, more dangerous. Henry Cutler pushed toward them again, his face twisted with rage and grief. Other men were joining him. The mood was shifting from spectacle to mob. Eleanor felt it happening, felt the air getting heavier, meaner. She told Daniel about that night in short, flat words. Not because she wanted to, because he needed to understand what he was buying, what he was tying his life to. She told him about Wade's hands on her throat, about the words they'd whispered, about the moment when begging had stopped working and fighting had become the only option left. When it ended, she said, "I stood there looking at what I'd done. 3 bodies. So much blood. And the worst part," her voice dropped to almost nothing, "the worst part was that some small, terrible part of me was glad. Glad I'd been strong enough. Glad they'd died instead of me. Does that make me evil?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "No. It makes you human." The simple certainty in his voice cracked something inside her. Eleanor felt tears burn behind her eyes. She blinked them back hard. She hadn't cried in 18 months. Wouldn't start now. A cloud of dust exploded near their feet. Someone had thrown something. Eleanor flinched, her body remembering the stones, the garbage, the spit. Her fingers tightened around Daniel's hand. Fight or flight. Those were the only options her body understood anymore. She was already calculating which way to run, how far she'd get before they caught her. Daniel felt her tension. He leaned closer so only she could hear. "I meant every word. This isn't pity. This isn't a game. I'm asking you to be my wife because I think 2 broken people might stand a better chance together than either of us would alone." "You don't know me," Eleanor said. "I could hurt you. I'm dangerous. Everyone says so." Daniel pulled back his coat just enough for her to see the worn grip of the Colt revolver at his hip, a gun that had been used, maintained with the care of someone who knew weapons. "I killed men too, in the war, after. Things I'm not proud of." His voice was rough with honesty. "I'm tired of living alone with ghosts and whiskey for company. I have a ranch in Colorado, my grandfather's place, empty for 3 years because I couldn't face going back. It needs work, needs 2 people. What if I say yes and then can't be what you need? Then we figure it out. Marriage is about partnership, about not being alone. The rest we can work through." Eleanor closed her eyes. She pictured it. A ranch, open land, no cage, no crowd, no shame, hard work instead of being a spectacle. She imagined waking up and not hearing the sound of coins clinking as strangers paid to mock her. She imagined space to breathe. But marriage. She'd been married before. Thomas had been gentle, patient, kind. This man was a stranger who'd just bought her for $500. What did he expect? What would he demand? As if reading her thoughts, Daniel spoke again. "I'm asking you to marry me so you're protected by law. As my wife, you're free. No one can put you back in that cage. We'll go before a preacher tonight if you're willing." But what happens after, that's up to you. I won't force anything. We have time to figure out what this is." Eleanor opened her eyes. Daniel was still there, still holding her hand. Behind him the cage door hung open and useless. Around them the crowd pressed closer, faces twisted with fear and fascination and anger. Sheriff Blackwood's hand hovered near his gun, like he was thinking maybe he'd made a mistake. Maybe he should take back the sale. For 18 months, Eleanor had lived without a single choice. Someone else decided when she ate, when she stood, when she slept. Someone else decided she was guilty without asking her side. Someone else decided her body was public property to be viewed and touched for the right price. Now Daniel Hartley was offering her a choice, a real one. She could say yes, could take the ring and the protection and the chance at a different life. Or she could say no, could take the freedom and walk away alone. Eleanor looked at the ring in Daniel's palm. Simple gold, old, loved. She looked at the cage behind them. She looked at Daniel's face, weathered and weary and honest. She lifted her chin. In a voice that carried across the square, clear and strong and final, she gave her answer. Yes. The word rolled out like thunder. For one stunned heartbeat, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The giant widow had said yes to the stranger. Then sound crashed back into the world. Men cursed, women gasped. Someone shouted that Daniel had lost his mind. Someone else yelled that Eleanor would kill him in his sleep. Daniel barely heard them. His attention stayed fixed on the woman at his side. Eleanor still held herself rigid, like she expected a blow at any second. But something had changed in her pale blue eyes. The dead flat look was gone. In its place was a small, trembling spark, like a coal that refused to die no matter how much dirt the world threw over it. Eleanor leaned toward him so only he could hear. "We need to leave, now, before they change their minds." Her voice was steady, but he could feel her hand shaking in his. She knew how fast fear could turn into a rope, how quickly a crowd could become a mob. Daniel nodded once. Still holding her hand, he walked her through the crowd toward his horse. People stepped back to let them pass, but the mood was ugly. Someone spat at Eleanor's feet. A voice yelled that she'd cut his throat before morning. Another voice called her a demon. Daniel didn't respond. He'd spent enough time in rough saloons to know when words just poured oil on fire. At the horse's side, he released her hand and set his own hands carefully at her waist. Eleanor's whole body locked up, went rigid as stone, her breath caught. She was back in the alley for a moment, hands grabbing her, pulling at her dress, voices in her ear saying terrible things. But Daniel's grip stayed gentle, respectful. He lifted her up to the saddle the way he might help any lady mount a horse. No force, no aggression, just assistance. Then he stepped back immediately, giving her space. Eleanor forced herself to breathe, to come back to the present. She settled into the saddle, found the stirrups with her boots, straightened her shoulders. Daniel mounted in front of her. The saddle was built for one, so there was no choice but to sit close. Eleanor hesitated for only a second before wrapping her arms around his waist. The contact felt sharp and strange. For 18 months every touch had meant pain. Chains, rough hands pushing her toward the cage. Now she was holding onto a man who'd bought her freedom with gold. They rode down Main Street at a walk, past the saloon with its swinging doors and stale beer smell, past the small white church where Eleanor had married Thomas 6 years ago, past the general store and the feed shop and the houses where respectable families lived. People stared from porches and windows, the giant widow and the stranger leaving Willow Creek on the same horse. Nobody tried to stop them. The town had sold its monster and seemed glad to see her go. When they passed the last building and hit open trail, Daniel urged the horse into a steady lope. The land opened wide around them, dry grass rolling toward low hills, distant blue ridges shimmering in the heat. Wind tugged at Eleanor's hair and brought tears to her eyes that she blamed on dust. She pressed her cheek against the back of Daniel's coat and breathed in the smell of leather and sweat and old campfires. To her it smelled like motion, like distance, like the first real breath of freedom. For a long stretch neither of them spoke. Hooves beat a steady rhythm on the hard ground. Leather creaked. A hawk cried somewhere high above them, then the sky went quiet again. Eleanor's thoughts tumbled over each other, chaotic and sharp. She'd agreed to marry a stranger because he'd seen her as more than a beast in a cage. Now that the cage was behind her, reality started pressing in. What now? Who was this man? What did he really want? What happened when they reached wherever they were going, and she had to make good on her promise? Daniel's voice reached her rough from the wind and the silence. "There's a preacher in a town called Pine Ridge, about 2 days' ride east. If you still want to do this, we can be there by tomorrow evening. Get married that night." He paused. "If you change your mind, I'll still see you free and give you what money I can spare. You don't owe me anything." The word free hit Eleanor like a fist to the chest. In the cage, she dreamed about freedom constantly. In every dream, she walked away alone into empty country and never heard her name again. She'd imagined disappearing so completely that even she forgot who she'd been. But now, with her arms around Daniel's ribs and solid weight in front of her, the thought of climbing down and walking away brought a different kind of fear. Sharper, smaller, the fear of being truly alone. She spoke near his shoulder, her lips close enough to feel the heat of his skin through his shirt. "Why did you really do it? You could have paid your dollar, looked your fill ridden on, forgotten the giant widow like everyone else does. Instead, you threw $500 at a corrupt sheriff and tied your life to a woman half the territory calls a monster. I need to know what you expect in return." Daniel was quiet for several long breaths. Then he started talking. About a woman named Grace, his wife. Small and quick, he said with a laugh that filled every corner of their little cabin. She'd been pregnant with their first child when fever came through the valley 3 years ago. In one long night he'd lost them both, wife and daughter. He'd put them in the ground on a hill overlooking their ranch, and after that he hadn't much cared whether he lived or died. He told her about the drinking, the fights he'd picked with men twice his size, hoping they'd finish what the fever had started, the jobs he'd taken that kept him moving because standing still hurt too much, the nights he'd put his gun in his mouth and sat there for hours, finger on the trigger, too much of a coward to pull it. "The pain doesn't fade," he said. "It just sinks deeper, settles into your bones until it feels like part of who you are." His voice was flat, matter of fact. "When I rode into Willow Creek and saw you in that cage, I recognized that same hollow look. Someone who'd lost everything and then been punished for trying to survive the loss. I knew if I turned my horse and rode away, I'd hear that cage door clanging in my sleep for the rest of my life." Eleanor listened with her face against his back. His words slid into the cracks inside her the way rain works into hard, dry ground. She heard her own story in his. The graves, the long nights, the way grief could twist a person into something the world no longer understood. "Is this your way of being a hero?" she asked quietly. "Rescuing the beast?" "I'm no hero. I'm tired, Eleanor. Tired of talking to ghosts. Tired of waking up alone and not remembering why I bothered. I don't want a woman to worship me or thank me or owe me. I want a partner who understands what it feels like to hurt and still get up every morning. I think you might want the same thing." The sun slid lower as they rode. The land lifted into soft foothills. Scattered pines appeared, then grew thicker. Ahead, Eleanor saw thin lines of smoke rising into the evening sky. The pointed roof of a small church steeple. Pine Ridge waited in a shallow valley, quiet and plain and wonderfully ordinary. A place where nothing terrible ever happened. Or at least a place where terrible things could be left behind. As they rode down toward the town, Eleanor made her choice again, this time without a crowd screaming for her blood. The first yes had been defiance, a weapon thrown in the faces of people who wanted her dead. This yes rose from somewhere deeper, quieter. "If you still want me," she said against his shoulder, "I'll stand with you before the preacher. I can't promise my heart. It's too bruised, too tired, but I can promise to work, to try, to walk beside you instead of walking alone." Daniel let out a slow breath. She felt the tension ease from his shoulders under her hands. "That's all I'm asking." For the first time since she'd seen him standing by the cage, a quiet warmth moved through Eleanor's chest. Not joy, not happiness. Something steadier, something that felt almost like hope. They rode into Pine Ridge just as the church bell finished its evening call and the sky turned gold and purple overhead. Pine Ridge was smaller than Willow Creek. Maybe 24 buildings clustered around a main street that was more dirt path than proper road. A general store, a blacksmith shop, a modest hotel, and at the center of it all, a white wooden church with a simple bell tower that caught the last golden light of evening. Daniel guided the horse toward the church and stopped in front of the hitching post. He dismounted first, then turned to help Eleanor down. She hesitated, looking at his outstretched hands, then carefully placed her hands on his shoulders and let him lift her. Her legs nearly buckled when her boots hit the ground. 18 months of sitting had stolen her strength. Daniel steadied her with a hand at her elbow, light and careful. "Can you walk?" Eleanor nodded, though her knees felt like water. She took a step, then another. Daniel stayed close but didn't crowd her. They were halfway to the church door when a sound stopped them both. A child crying. Not the angry wail of a tantrum, but the broken, hopeless sobbing of someone who'd cried until there was nothing left. Eleanor's head turned toward the sound. Behind the general store, partially hidden by barrels and crates, sat a small boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. His clothes were patched and dirty. His face was streaked with tears and dust. He sat with his knees drawn up to his chest, arms wrapped around them, rocking slightly. Daniel put a hand on Eleanor's arm. "We should get you inside. Get you married before anyone here decides to ask questions." But Eleanor was already moving toward the boy. Her legs steadied with purpose. She crossed the dusty street and knelt down a few feet away from him, not too close, giving him space. "What's wrong?" she asked softly. The boy's head jerked up. He stared at her with red, swollen eyes, looked her up and down, saw a woman taller than seemed natural with rough hands and a torn dress and dirt under her fingernails. Most children would have run, but this boy just wiped his nose on his sleeve and answered, "My mama died. Last week. Smallpox." Eleanor's chest tightened. "Where's your papa?" "Dead. 2 years ago. Accident at the mine." The words hit Eleanor like stones. An orphan. Alone. Just like she'd been after her own parents died when she was 16. Just like Daniel had been after Grace and the baby. "What's your name?" "Tommy. Tommy Brennan." Eleanor's breath caught. Brennan. The same last name as her dead husband Thomas. Coincidence, probably. Brennan wasn't uncommon, but it felt like a sign, like Thomas reaching back from the grave to remind her that kindness still existed in the world. Daniel had followed her. He knelt down beside Eleanor, studying the boy with careful eyes. "Where are you staying, son?" "Mrs. Cooper said I could sleep in her barn if I work for my keep, clean the stalls, feed the horses." Tommy's voice was flat, the voice of a child who'd already learned that life was hard and help was rare. Eleanor and Daniel looked at each other. A whole conversation happened in that look. She saw his hesitation. They were about to get married, 2 strangers trying to figure out their own arrangement. Adding a child to that equation was complicated, dangerous even. But she also saw something else in his gray eyes. Recognition. The same thing she'd seen when he looked at her through the bars. Pain calling to pain. Broken pieces drawn together. "He's coming with us," Eleanor said. Not a question. A statement. "Eleanor, we don't know anything about this situation. We don't know if he has family looking for him. We can't just... He's coming with us." Her voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. The same steel that had helped her survive the cage. Daniel held her gaze for a long moment, then looked at Tommy. The boy was staring at them both with something desperate and fragile in his eyes. Hope. The most dangerous thing in the world. Daniel nodded slowly. "All right. But first we need to talk to whoever's in charge. Make sure this is legal." Tommy scrambled to his feet. "You mean it? You'd take me with you." "We mean it," Eleanor said. "But you have to understand something. Life on a ranch is hard work. Everyone pulls their weight. Can you do that?" The boy nodded so hard his whole body shook. "I can work. I'm strong. I can do anything you need." Daniel stood and offered his hand to Eleanor. She took it and let him pull her to her feet. "Come on," he said to Tommy. "Let's find the preacher. He'll know what needs doing." They walked to the church together, an odd trio. A tall woman with a haunted look, a weathered cowboy with grief in his eyes, a small boy who clung to them like they were the only solid things in a world that kept falling apart. The church door was heavy wood worn smooth by years of hands pushing it open. Daniel knocked twice. After a moment, the door swung inward to reveal a man in his 60s with white hair and kind eyes. He wore simple black clothes and held a Bible in one hand. "Can I help you folks?" Daniel removed his hat. "Reverend, my name is Daniel Hartley. This is Eleanor Brennan. We'd like to be married, tonight if possible." The Reverend's gaze moved from Daniel to Eleanor to Tommy. He didn't ask the obvious questions, didn't demand explanations for the strange request or the disheveled appearance or the child standing between them. He just nodded slowly. "I'm Reverend Samuel Cole. Come inside." The interior of the church was simple. Wooden pews, a small altar, candles burning in brass holders. It smelled like beeswax and old hymnals. Reverend Cole led them to the front and gestured for them to sit. "Now then," he said gently, "tell me what brings you to Pine Ridge." Daniel told him. Not everything, but enough. He'd been traveling, met Eleanor in difficult circumstances, wanted to do right by her, needed a preacher willing to marry them without a lot of questions or waiting. Reverend Cole listened without interrupting. When Daniel finished, the old man turned to Eleanor. "And you, Miss Brennan, you agree to this marriage?" Eleanor met his eyes. "Yes, sir." "May I ask why you seem like a woman who's been through something hard? Marriage is a serious commitment. Are you sure this is what you want?" For a moment, Eleanor considered telling him everything. About Thomas, about the attack, about the cage. But the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she said, "I'm sure. Daniel offered me a chance at a different life. I'm taking it." The Reverend studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll marry you. But first, let's talk about this young man." He turned to Tommy, who'd been standing quietly, hands clasped in front of him. "Your mother was Mary Brennan, wasn't she?" Tommy nodded. "I performed her funeral service last week." "I'm sorry for your loss, son. She was a good woman." He paused. "Do you have any family? Aunts, uncles, cousins?" "No, sir. It was just me and Mama." "And these folks want to take you with them?" "Yes, sir." Tommy's voice was small but steady. Reverend Cole looked at Daniel and Eleanor again. "You understand what you're taking on. A child needs more than just food and shelter. He needs care, guidance, love." "We understand," Daniel said. The Reverend was quiet for a moment, then called out, "Ruth, can you come here, please?" A woman appeared from a back room. Reverend Cole's wife, presumably. She was perhaps 55 with silver hair and a gentle face. She took one look at Eleanor and immediately moved to her side. "My dear, you look exhausted. When's the last time you ate or bathed?" Eleanor's throat tightened at the simple kindness in the woman's voice. "I don't remember." Mrs. Cole took her hand. "Come with me. We'll get you cleaned up before the ceremony. You deserve to feel human on your wedding day." Eleanor let herself be led to a small room behind the church. There was a basin of water soap, clean towels. Mrs. Cole helped her out of her torn, dirty dress and brought her a simple but clean one in pale blue. "This was my daughter's," she said softly. "She's married now, living in Denver. But she'd want you to have it for today." As Eleanor washed the months of grime from her skin, Mrs. Cole gently combed the tangles from her hair. Neither of them spoke much. But when Eleanor's shoulders started shaking and tears finally came, Mrs. Cole just held her and let her cry. "You're safe now, child," she murmured. "Whatever happened before, you're safe now." Meanwhile, in the main church, Reverend Cole was having a different conversation with Daniel. He'd sent Tommy to the kitchen with instructions to eat whatever he could find. "Mr. Hartley, I'm going to ask you something directly. Are you doing this out of pity?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "No, sir." "Then why? You don't know this woman. You're taking on responsibility for her and a child you just met. Most men would run the other direction. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. 3 years ago, I buried my wife and daughter. Since then, I've been looking for a reason to care whether I wake up in the morning. Today, I rode into Willow Creek and saw a woman in a cage. They were charging money for people to look at her, touch her, like she was an animal. His hands clenched into fists. She didn't cry, didn't beg, just sat there with her dignity intact while the world tried to break her. And I thought, that's someone who knows what it costs to survive. That's someone who might understand. Understand what? That some days living is the hardest thing you can do, and maybe two people who know that truth can help each other through it. Reverend Cole studied him. You're not a young man anymore, Daniel. Neither is she a young woman. You've both lived, both lost. This could work, or it could be two broken people trying to fix each other and just breaking worse. It could, Daniel agreed. But doing nothing felt worse. A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Cole stood there with Eleanor. The transformation was remarkable. Clean skin, hair braided neatly down her back, the blue dress fitting her tall frame properly. She still looked tired, still had shadows under her eyes, but she also looked human again, like a woman instead of a spectacle. Daniel stood when he saw her. For a moment he just stared. Then he cleared his throat. You look nice. Eleanor's cheeks flushed slightly. Thank you. Tommy came running from the kitchen, his face cleaner, his belly full. Miss Eleanor, you look like a real lady. She smiled at him, a small smile rusty from disuse but genuine. Thank you, Tommy. Reverend Cole moved to the altar. Well then, if everyone's ready, let's begin. They stood before him. Daniel on the left, Eleanor on the right, Tommy between them, holding the ring that Daniel had given him to carry. Mrs. Cole stood as witness. Dearly beloved, Reverend Cole began, we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. He spoke the traditional words, about marriage being a sacred bond, about commitment through good times and bad, about forsaking all others. Eleanor barely heard most of it. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Daniel Hartley, do you take Eleanor Brennan to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, in sickness and in health till death do you part? Daniel's voice was steady. I do. And do you, Eleanor Brennan, take Daniel Hartley to be your lawfully wedded husband? To have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, in sickness and in health till death do you part? Eleanor thought about Thomas, about the love they'd shared, about the cage, about this stranger who'd bought her freedom, about the risk she was taking. And then she thought about Tommy looking up at her with hope in his eyes, about the ranch Daniel had described, about the possibility, however slim, of building something new from the wreckage of her old life. I do. Daniel took the ring from Tommy and slid it onto Eleanor's finger. It was slightly too large, but it stayed on. The gold felt heavy and strange against her rough skin. Reverend Cole smiled. By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Daniel, you may kiss your bride. Daniel looked at Eleanor. He didn't rush, didn't grab. He raised his hand slowly and gently cupped her face. Then he leaned in and kissed her forehead, just her forehead, soft, respectful, a promise without demands. Eleanor's eyes closed. Tears slipped down her cheeks. This man she barely knew had just given her more gentleness than she'd felt in 2 years. Tommy clapped his hands. Now we're a family. Mrs. Cole wiped her own eyes. Even Reverend Cole looked touched. Congratulations, he said warmly. May God bless your union. Daniel shook his hand. Thank you, Reverend. What do we owe you? Nothing. Just treat each other with kindness. That's payment enough. Mrs. Cole pressed a basket into Eleanor's hands. Food for your journey, and the dress is yours to keep. Eleanor tried to speak but couldn't find words. She just nodded and hugged the older woman tightly. They left the church as the last light faded from the sky. Reverend Cole had directed them to a small boarding house across the street. The proprietor, an elderly widow named Mrs. Jensen, showed them to a room on the second floor. It was simple. A bed, a washstand, a window overlooking the street. "I've got a cot I can set up for the boy," Mrs. Jensen said. "Give you folks some privacy." But Tommy looked so terrified at the idea of being separated that Eleanor shook her head. "No need. He can sleep in here with us." Mrs. Jensen raised her eyebrows but didn't argue. "Suit yourself. Breakfast is at 7. When the door closed, the three of them stood in awkward silence. Daniel set his saddlebags down. Eleanor clutched the basket of food. Tommy looked from one to the other, uncertain. Finally, Daniel spoke. "You hungry?" They ate in near silence, bread and cheese and cold chicken from the basket. Tommy demolished his portion with the desperate speed of someone who'd gone hungry before. Eleanor ate slowly, her stomach unaccustomed to real food after months of thin gruel. When they finished, Daniel said, "Tommy, why don't you wash up at the basin? Then you can have the bed." "But where will you sleep?" "I'll take the floor. Done it plenty of times." "What about Miss Eleanor?" Eleanor and Daniel looked at each other. This was the question, wasn't it? The one they'd been avoiding. They were married now, legally bound. What did that mean for tonight? For every night after? "The bed's big enough for 2, Eleanor said quietly. "If we stay on our own sides." Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly. "Are you sure?" "We're married. We can share a bed without—" She trailed off, unable to say it. "Without expectations," Daniel finished. "Yes, we can." Tommy washed up quickly and climbed into bed, still wearing his clothes. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed him, and he was asleep, his breathing deep and even. Eleanor washed next, using the corner of a towel to clean her face and hands. Daniel turned his back to give her privacy. Then he washed while she changed into the nightgown Mrs. Cole had included in the basket. He'd borrowed a razor from Reverend Cole earlier and shaved quickly, wanting to look proper for the wedding. When they finally lay down on opposite sides of the bed with Tommy between them like a small barrier, Eleanor stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning she'd woken in a cage. Tonight she was in a real bed, clean-fed, married, free. "Daniel," she whispered, "thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked away." There was a long pause. Then his voice came through the darkness. "You saved me too. You just don't know it yet." Eleanor wanted to ask what he meant, but sleep was pulling at her. Real sleep. Safe sleep. For the first time in 18 months, she closed her eyes without fear. She didn't know that outside the boarding house a man sat on his horse in the shadows. Henry Cutler had followed them from Willow Creek, staying far enough back to avoid notice. He watched the window of their room until the light went out. Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a stone. He tied a piece of paper around it with string. He rode close to the building, wound up his arm, and threw the stone through the window of the first-floor sitting room. The crash of breaking glass was loud in the quiet night. He didn't wait to see the result, just turned his horse and rode back into the darkness. Daniel was up instantly, gun in hand. Eleanor sat up, heart pounding. Tommy woke with a cry of fear. "Stay here," Daniel ordered. He moved to their window carefully and looked down at the street below, saw a man on horseback disappearing into shadows, then heard Mrs. Jensen scream from downstairs. He went downstairs. Mrs. Jensen was already there in her nightgown and robe, staring at the broken window of the sitting room. Shattered glass covered the floor. Who would do such a thing? Daniel picked up the stone, unwrapped the paper, read the message scrawled in rough handwriting. "Murderer. You can't hide. I'm coming." He crumpled the paper in his fist. Henry Cutler, the blacksmith from Willow Creek, Wade's brother. Of course he'd followed them. Of course revenge wouldn't die just because they'd left town. Eleanor appeared on the stairs, Tommy behind her, clinging to her skirt. She saw Daniel's face and knew. "It's him, isn't it, Henry?" Daniel nodded. "We leave at dawn. We ride hard for Colorado. No stops unless absolutely necessary. He'll follow. Then we'll be ready." Mrs. Jensen looked between them, confused and frightened. "Should I send for the sheriff?" "No," Daniel said. "This is between us and a man from Willow Creek. Best if Pine Ridge stays out of it." He paid her extra for the broken window. Then they went back upstairs and packed what little they had. None of them slept the rest of that night. At first light, they were already gone. The journey to Colorado took 5 days, days that blurred together in a haze of dust and heat and constant vigilance. Daniel bought a second horse in Pine Ridge so Tommy could ride separately. The boy had some experience with horses and proved to be a quick learner. They rode hard the first day, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Pine Ridge. At night they made cold camps with no fires to give away their position. Daniel took first watch while Eleanor and Tommy slept. Then Eleanor insisted on taking second watch despite Daniel's protests. "I can shoot," she said. "Thomas taught me even though he didn't like guns." Daniel showed her his rifle, taught her how to load it quickly, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling. She learned fast. Her hands were steady. On the second night she hit a tin can from 50 yards in the dim light of dusk. "Natural talent," Daniel said with something like respect in his voice. On the third day they encountered other travelers, a family in a wagon heading east. The man stared at Eleanor with curiosity. "Mighty tall woman you got there." Daniel's hand moved to his gun. "That's my wife. Mind your manners." The man backed off quickly, but after they passed, Eleanor said, "You don't have to defend me from every comment." "Yes, I do. You're my wife now. Anyone disrespects you, disrespects me." Something warm uncurled in Eleanor's chest. Protection. Not because he thought she couldn't defend herself, but because he thought she deserved defending. On the fourth day, a storm rolled in. Lightning split the sky and rain fell in sheets. They found shelter in a small cave barely large enough for the 3 of them and the horses. They huddled together for warmth, sharing Daniel's coat as a blanket. Tommy fell asleep between them, exhausted. In the darkness, with rain drumming against rock, Eleanor spoke quietly. "I'm scared. Of Henry. Of myself." Her voice was barely audible over the storm. "When I fought those men in the alley, part of me enjoyed it, enjoyed being stronger, enjoyed making them pay for every cruel word, every mocking laugh, every time someone made me feel like a freak." She paused. "What if I am a monster? What if that's the truth everyone saw except Thomas?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words were careful, honest. "You're not a monster, Eleanor. Monsters don't ask that question. Monsters don't care. They don't lie awake worrying about whether they're good people. But I liked it. The fighting, the power. You liked not being helpless. There's a difference." He shifted slightly. "I've killed men. In the war. Afterward. Some of them deserved it. Some probably didn't. I don't lose sleep over the ones who deserved it. Does that make me a monster?" "No." "Then extend yourself the same grace." Eleanor turned those words over in her mind. Grace. When was the last time she'd given herself grace for anything? On the 5th day, they crested a rise and saw it. The ranch. Daniel's grandfather's land. 160 acres of rolling grass and scattered trees with a creek running through the middle and mountains rising blue and distant behind it. The house was small log construction with a barn and a few outbuildings. From this distance it looked peaceful, abandoned but peaceful. As they rode closer, reality set in. The fences were fallen in places. Grass grew wild. The barn door hung crooked. The house itself looked intact but weathered like it had stood empty through 3 hard winters. An old man emerged from the barn as they approached. He was maybe 70, bent slightly with age, but his eyes were sharp. When he saw Daniel, his weathered face broke into a smile. "Danny boy, you finally came home." Daniel dismounted and embraced the man. "Jim, I didn't think you'd still be here." "Where else would I be? Someone had to watch the place." Old Jim stepped back and looked at Eleanor and Tommy. "And who are these folks?" "This is my wife Eleanor, and this is Tommy. They're family now." Jim's eyes widened slightly at Eleanor's height, but his smile didn't falter. He walked over and offered his hand. "Ma'am, welcome to the Hartley Ranch. It's rough right now, but good bones. Good land." Eleanor shook his hand, grateful for his easy acceptance. "Thank you, Mr. Just Jim. We don't stand on ceremony out here." He looked at Tommy. "And you, young man, you know how to work?" Tommy stood up straighter. "Yes, sir. I can do anything you need." "We'll see about that. Come on, I'll show you where everything is." As Jim led Tommy toward the barn, Daniel and Eleanor stood looking at the house. Their house now. It needed work, a lot of work, but it was theirs, a place to start over. "It's not much," Daniel said quietly. Eleanor thought about the cage, about the crowd, about the cage, about 18 months of having nothing being nothing except a thing people paid to see. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. They spent the rest of that day settling in. The house was dusty but sound. 2 rooms and a loft, a stone fireplace that still worked, furniture covered in sheets. Eleanor cleaned while Daniel and Jim checked the barn and outbuildings. Tommy helped wherever he was needed, desperate to prove his worth. By evening they had a fire going and a simple meal of salt pork and beans. The 4 of them sat together, tired but satisfied with the day's work. Jim told stories about Daniel's grandfather, about building this ranch from nothing. Tommy listened with wide eyes. Eleanor watched Daniel's face soften as he heard stories about family, about home. After dinner, Jim took Tommy to show him the stars from the hilltop behind the house. Daniel and Eleanor were left alone for the first time since the wedding. They sat by the fire, not speaking for a while. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "This morning before we left Pine Ridge, I was thinking about Thomas, about how he would have wanted me to be happy again, to live instead of just survive." Daniel poked at the fire with a stick. "Grace would have said the same thing. She was always telling me not to let grief turn me mean." "Did it turn you mean?" "For a while. I picked fights, drank too much, did things I'm not proud of." He paused. "Then I saw you in that cage, and something shifted, like Grace was telling me to wake up, to do something that mattered." Eleanor looked at him in the firelight. This man who'd spent a fortune to buy a stranger, who'd married her with no expectations, who'd accepted a homeless boy into their makeshift family without hesitation. "I love you," she said quietly. The words surprised them both. Daniel's head snapped up. "Eleanor, not the way I loved Thomas, not yet. Maybe not ever in the same way, but I love you for seeing me as human when no one else did, for giving me a choice when I'd had none, for being kind when you could have been cruel." She paused. "That's a kind of love. Maybe it's enough." Daniel set down the stick. He stood and held out his hand. Eleanor took it and let him pull her to her feet. They stood close, the fire warming their backs. "I love you too," he said, "for reminding me what courage looks like, for being stronger than you know, for saying yes when you could have said no." He kissed her then. Not on the forehead this time, on the lips, gentle, questioning. Eleanor kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. It wasn't passion, not yet, but it was real. It was a beginning. They pulled apart when they heard Tommy and Jim coming back down the hill, Tommy's excited voice carrying through the night air as he described constellations. Eleanor smiled. "We should probably talk about sleeping arrangements, for real this time." Daniel smiled back. "We have time to figure it out. We have all the time in the world." But they didn't. Because the next morning, as Daniel was out checking fence lines and Eleanor was starting breakfast, 3 riders appeared on the eastern ridge. Even from a distance, Eleanor recognized the lead rider, Henry Cutler. He'd brought reinforcements. She ran to the barn where Tommy was feeding the horses. "Get Jim. Get Daniel. Now." Tommy's eyes went wide, but he didn't ask questions. He just ran. Eleanor went back to the house and grabbed the rifle Daniel had taught her to use. She loaded it with steady hands and waited on the porch. By the time Henry and his men reached the house, Daniel was there beside her. Jim stood on her other side with an old shotgun. Tommy hid behind the door like Eleanor had told him to. Henry Cutler reined in his horse 20 feet from the porch. His 2 companions flanked him. Rough-looking men? Hired guns, probably. "Eleanor Brennan," Henry called out. "Or should I say, Eleanor Hartley? Doesn't matter. You're still a murderer. You're still going to pay for what you did to my brother." "Your brother tried to rape me," Eleanor said, her voice carrying across the space. "I defended myself. That's the law." "That's what you call it. 3 men dead, and you call it self-defense. They attacked me first. Ask Sheriff Blackwood. Oh, wait, you can't. He's probably counting the gold he got for selling me." Henry's face went purple with rage. "I'm giving you one chance. Come with me. Face justice in Willow Creek. We'll have a proper trial." "We both know that's a lie," Daniel said. "You want revenge, not justice." "Stay out of this, stranger. This is between me and the woman who killed my blood." One of Henry's companions, a lean man with a scar across his cheek, spoke up. "Boss, maybe we should just—" "Shut up," Henry snapped. He pulled his gun. "Last chance. Come peaceful, or we take you." Everything happened at once. Henry aimed his gun at Eleanor. Daniel's hand dropped to his holster. The scarred man reached for his weapon, and Eleanor, acting on pure instinct, raised the rifle and fired. The bullet hit the ground 2 feet in front of Henry's horse. The animal reared, nearly throwing him. The other 2 horses spooked and danced sideways. "Next one won't miss," Eleanor said calmly. "Get off my land." "Your land?" Henry steadied his horse. "You don't own anything. Your property. Your—" Daniel's gun was out now, hammer cocked. "My wife said get off our land." Jim's shotgun swung toward the scarred man. "I'd listen if I were you boys. 3 on 3 ain't odds you want when we've got the high ground." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Then the third man, who'd been silent until now, said quietly, "Henry, this ain't worth dying over." Henry looked at Eleanor with pure hatred, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. Slowly, he holstered his weapon. "This ain't over." "Yes," Eleanor said firmly, "it is. Your brother attacked me. I survived. That's the end of the story. If you can't accept that, then you're going to have to shoot me. And if you shoot me, my husband will kill you. Then his friend will kill your men. Everybody dies. Is that what you want? Is avenging your rapist brother worth dying for?" The blunt words hit like a slap. Henry flinched. For a moment, doubt flickered in his eyes. His brother Wade hadn't been a good man. Everyone in Willow Creek knew it. But he'd been family. Blood. And blood demanded blood. But was it worth dying over? Henry pulled his horse's reins hard. "I'll pray for your soul," he spat, "because you're going to need it." He wheeled his horse around and rode away. His 2 men followed after casting uncertain glances back at the house. Eleanor stood on the porch until they disappeared over the ridge. Then her legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the wooden steps. The rifle clattered beside her. Her whole body shook. Daniel sat down next to her, put his arm around her shoulders. This time she leaned into him. "You did good," he said quietly. "I could have killed him. I wanted to. But you didn't. You gave him a choice. He chose to leave. That's mercy, Eleanor. That's strength." Tommy crept out from behind the door and threw his arms around Eleanor's neck. "You were so brave, Mama Eleanor." The name punched through her defenses. Mama. This boy she'd known less than a week was calling her Mama. She hugged him back, tears streaming down her face. "We're safe now. We're all safe." But even as she said it, she wondered if it was true. The days after Henry's visit fell into a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. Almost. Daniel rose before dawn to check fences and tend the animals. Eleanor worked the garden that had gone wild during the 3 years of abandonment, coaxing vegetables from soil that had nearly forgotten what it meant to be cultivated. Tommy followed Jim around like a shadow, learning everything the old cowhand could teach him about ranching. And every night they all gathered around the table for supper, a makeshift family bound together by need and something that was slowly becoming more. Eleanor discovered she liked the work. Liked the way her muscles burned at the end of a long day. Liked seeing tangible results from her labor. Each fence post she set, each row she weeded, each board she nailed, was proof that she existed as more than a spectacle, more than a cautionary tale. She was building something, creating instead of destroying. But the shadow of Henry Cutler's threat never fully left. Daniel started teaching her to shoot in earnest. Every evening after chores, they'd set up tin cans on the fence rail, and she'd practice until her shoulder ached from the rifle's kick. Her aim improved rapidly. By the end of the first week, she could hit a target from 100 yards. "You're better than I was after a month of training," Daniel admitted one evening, watching her reload with smooth efficiency. "I had good motivation to learn," Eleanor replied, sighting down the barrel at a distant can. Tommy sat on the porch steps watching them with serious eyes. The boy had nightmares sometimes, would wake up crying for his mother. Eleanor would go to him, hold him, remind him he wasn't alone anymore. Those moments cracked something open inside her, made her feel protective in a way she hadn't since Thomas died, made her realize she had more to lose now than just her own life. 3 weeks after Henry's visit, Jim rode out to check the north pasture and came back with news. "Riders coming? 2 of them. Look official." Daniel's hand went to his gun. "Henry." "No, one of them's wearing a badge, territorial marshal from the look of it." Eleanor felt her stomach drop. This was it. They'd come to take her back, to put her in the cage again, or worse, string her up for killing 3 men. All the peace she'd found here, all the work they'd done, it was about to be ripped away. Daniel saw the fear in her eyes. "Stay calm. We don't know what they want yet." But they both knew. The riders appeared a few minutes later. The one in front wore a marshal's badge and had the hard, weathered look of a man who'd seen too much and trusted too little. The second rider was Sheriff Vernon Blackwood from Willow Creek, looking considerably less confident than the last time Eleanor had seen him. The marshal dismounted and tipped his hat. "Afternoon. I'm looking for Daniel Hartley and Eleanor Brennan." "I'm Daniel Hartley. This is my wife, Eleanor Hartley." The marshal's eyes flicked to Eleanor, taking in her height, her work-roughened hands, the rifle she held with easy familiarity. "Mrs. Hartley, I'm Marshal William Ford. I need to ask you both some questions about an incident in Willow Creek several months back." Eleanor's grip tightened on the rifle. "What kind of questions?" "The kind about 3 dead men and a woman who was imprisoned without proper trial." He glanced at Sheriff Blackwood, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Sheriff Blackwood here has made some serious accusations. Says you aided the escape of a convicted criminal, Mr. Hartley. Says you paid him $500 to release a prisoner serving a lawful sentence." Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I have a receipt, signed by Reverend Cole of Pine Ridge, who witnessed the transaction. I didn't aid an escape. I purchased a human being that Sheriff Blackwood was illegally displaying for profit." Marshal Ford took the receipt and read it carefully. His expression didn't change. "That's an interesting interpretation." "Sheriff." Blackwood's face had gone pale. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. "That's not how it was. She was serving her sentence. I was just—" "The town council approved." "The town council approved keeping a woman in a cage and charging admission." Marshal Ford's voice was dangerously quiet. "That's what you're telling me. It was for the school fund." "How much of that $340 actually made it to the school fund, Sheriff?" Blackwood's mouth opened and closed like a fish. No sound came out. Marshal Ford turned back to Eleanor. "Mrs. Hartley, I need you to tell me what happened the night those 3 men died. All of it. Don't leave anything out." Eleanor glanced at Daniel. He nodded slightly. She took a breath and told the story one more time. About finishing work at the saloon. About the alley. About Wade Cutler's hands around her throat and the words he'd whispered in her ear. About fighting back with everything she had because the alternative was death, or worse. About standing over 3 bodies and knowing her life was over either way. She didn't cry, didn't beg, just stated the facts in a flat, empty voice that somehow made the horror of it more real. When she finished, Marshal Ford was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out a letter from his saddlebag. "Funny thing. About 2 weeks ago, I received this letter from a Dr. Peter Wilson in Willow Creek. He said his conscience had been bothering him. Said he treated a woman named Eleanor Brennan the night she was arrested. Said she had bruises around her throat consistent with strangulation, defensive wounds on her hands and arms, a torn dress, evidence that she'd been attacked. Sheriff Blackwood went from pale to gray. Doc Wilson had no right. He had every right. He's a doctor. He saw evidence of a crime and he reported it. Something you should have done, Sheriff. Marshal Ford's voice could have cut glass. Instead, you locked up the victim and made money off her suffering. That's called corruption and exploitation, and about a dozen other charges I can think of. Now wait just a minute. No, you wait. The marshal stepped closer to Blackwood. You're under arrest. Corruption, false imprisonment, exploitation. We can start with those and add more as we go. He pulled out handcuffs and snapped them onto Blackwood's wrists. The sheriff sputtered protests but didn't resist. He knew when he was beaten. Marshal Ford turned back to Eleanor. Mrs. Hartley, as far as I'm concerned, you acted in self-defense. Those men attacked you. You fought back. That's your legal right. The way you were treated after is a stain on Willow Creek and everyone who allowed it. He paused. The town council would like to offer you compensation, $500 for wrongful imprisonment, plus a formal apology. Eleanor stared at him. They want to pay me. They want to make this right, or at least they want to try. I don't want their money. Ma'am, I don't want their money, she repeated firmly. They can take that $500 and build their school, a real school this time, and they can teach their children that strength in a woman isn't something to fear or cage. That's the only compensation I need. Marshal Ford studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll pass that along, but they'd also like you to come back to Willow Creek, to be formally cleared of all charges, to have your name restored. Eleanor looked at Daniel, at the ranch spread out behind them, at Tommy peeking around the barn door, at Jim standing ready with his shotgun. This was home now. This was where she belonged. No, she said quietly. I'm done with Willow Creek. I have a life here, a family. That's all I need. The marshal seemed to understand. He touched the brim of his hat. Fair enough, ma'am. I'll make sure everyone knows you're cleared, that you were the victim, not the criminal. He hauled Sheriff Blackwood toward the horses. Come on, Sheriff, you've got a cell waiting for you. As they rode away, Blackwood twisted in his saddle to look back at Eleanor. His face was a mixture of fear and hatred, but Eleanor felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, just a deep, bone-weary relief that it was finally over. Daniel put his arm around her shoulders. You okay? I think so. She leaned into him. Is it really over? The legal part is. The rest? He trailed off, but she knew what he meant. The nightmares wouldn't stop just because a marshal said she was innocent. The memories wouldn't fade. The fear that had lived inside her for 18 months wouldn't disappear overnight. But maybe with time, it would get easier. That night, after Tommy was asleep in the loft, and Jim had retired to the small cabin he'd built for himself behind the barn, Daniel and Eleanor sat on the porch steps watching the stars. It had become their ritual, their quiet time to talk or not talk, to simply exist in each other's presence, without demands or expectations. I've been thinking, Daniel said slowly, about Grace, about Thomas. Eleanor waited. She'd learned that Daniel needed time to work through his thoughts before speaking them. When Grace died, I thought my life was over. Thought I'd never feel anything again except this hollow ache. He paused. Then I met you. And at first I thought maybe I could help you the way I couldn't help her. Save someone since I couldn't save her. Eleanor's chest tightened. Is that still what this is trying to save me? No. He turned to look at her. That's what I'm trying to say. Somewhere along the way it stopped being about saving you. You didn't need saving. You needed someone to stand beside you, and standing beside you has saved me. She felt tears prick her eyes. Daniel. I love you, Eleanor. Not because you remind me of Grace, not because I pity you, but because you're you, strong and stubborn and brave and kind, because you chose mercy with Henry when you could have chosen revenge, because you work harder than any man I've ever met and never complain, because you held a scared boy in the middle of the night and made him feel safe when your own world was falling apart. The tears spilled over. I love you too. I've been trying not to, trying to keep some distance in case this all fell apart, but I can't help it. You've given me back my life, my dignity, myself. Daniel reached up and gently wiped away her tears with his thumb. Can I kiss you? Really kiss you? Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. This kiss was different from the one after the wedding. That had been sweet, tentative, a promise. This was deeper, hungrier. Two people who'd been holding back, finally letting go. Eleanor's hands came up to tangle in Daniel's hair. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer. They kissed until they were both breathless, until the stars wheeled overhead and the night grew cold. When they finally pulled apart, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. I want you, not just as a partner or a friend, as a wife, in every way. Eleanor's heart pounded. She'd been intimate with Thomas, knew what to expect, but that had been different. Thomas had been gentle, patient, loving. Daniel was those things too, but he was also a man who'd seen war and death and grief, a man with rough edges and old wounds. I'm afraid, she admitted, of me, of disappointing you, of not being enough, of this being a mistake. Daniel pulled back slightly so he could look her in the eyes. Eleanor, you are more than enough. You've always been enough. If you're not ready, we wait. If you're never ready, we figure something else out. This isn't a demand, it's an offer. She thought about the cage, about the hands that had grabbed her in the alley, about all the ways men had tried to take from her without asking. And then she thought about Daniel, who'd given her nothing but choices from the moment he knelt in the dirt with his grandmother's ring. I'm ready, she said. I'm scared, but I'm ready. They went inside together, moving quietly so as not to wake Tommy. In their room, Daniel lit a lamp. The warm glow softened the rough log walls, made the space feel almost cozy. Eleanor stood by the bed, suddenly awkward and uncertain. She'd shared this bed with Daniel for weeks now, but always with careful distance between them, always clothed, always with the understanding that nothing would happen. Tonight was different. Daniel crossed to her slowly, gave her time to change her mind. When he reached her, he didn't grab or rush, just cupped her face in his hands and kissed her softly. If you want to stop at any point, you say so. Understood? Eleanor nodded. Her hands shook as she began unbuttoning her dress. Daniel helped her, his fingers gentle and patient. When she stood before him in just her shift, she resisted the urge to cover herself, to hide the body that had caused her so much trouble, the height, the strength, the muscles that made people call her unnatural. But Daniel wasn't looking at her with disgust or fear. He looked at her with want, with reverence. You're beautiful, he murmured. I'm too tall, too strong, too perfect. He cut her off. You're perfect. He kissed her again, and this time Eleanor let herself believe him, let herself feel desired instead of feared, let herself be vulnerable in a way she hadn't been since Thomas died. Later, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Eleanor felt something inside her finally truly settle. She was safe. She was loved. She was home. Daniel, she whispered. Thank you. For everything. He pulled her closer. Thank you for saying yes. In the square. At the church. Tonight. Every time you could have chosen to walk away and didn't. Eleanor pressed her face against his chest and listened to his heartbeat. Strong, steady, real. She'd survived the cage, survived the fear, survived the shame, and now finally she was starting to live again. The next morning, Tommy came barreling into their room before the sun was fully up. Mama Eleanor, Papa Daniel, there's people coming. They dressed quickly and went outside. A small group was riding up the road, 5 people on horseback. As they got closer, Eleanor recognized one of them. Annabelle Price, the young woman from Pine Ridge who'd been kind to her before the wedding. But the others were strangers. The group stopped in front of the house. An older man in a fine suit dismounted first. Mr. and Mrs. Hartley, I'm Mayor George Preston from Willow Creek. May we speak with you? Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse, to send them away. Willow Creek had taken everything from her. She owed them nothing. But Daniel squeezed her hand. Let's hear what they have to say. The mayor cleared his throat. Mrs. Hartley, on behalf of the town of Willow Creek, I want to offer our deepest apologies. We failed you. We failed to investigate properly. We failed to give you a fair trial. We failed to see you as a human being deserving of dignity and justice. You put me in a cage, Eleanor said flatly. You charged people money to look at me, to touch me, like I was an animal. Yes, we did. And there's no excuse for that. No amount of apologizing can undo it. He paused. But we want to try to make amends. We've brought the $500 Marshall Ford mentioned. We've also taken down the cage, melted it down, used the metal to make a bell for the new school. He gestured to one of the other riders who held up a letter. We've also collected signatures from everyone in town, an official statement declaring you innocent, acknowledging what was done to you was wrong. Eleanor took the letter, unfolded it, saw dozens of names, people who'd watched her suffer and done nothing. Now they wanted forgiveness. Why now? She asked. Why not when I was locked in that cage begging for someone to listen? An older woman dismounted. Eleanor recognized her as the doctor's wife. Because we were cowards, she said simply. We were afraid. Of you. Of challenging authority. Of admitting we were wrong. But fear is no excuse for cruelty. We know that now. Annabelle spoke up. Not everyone in Willow Creek is bad, Eleanor. Some of us tried to speak up. We just weren't loud enough. But we're trying to do better now. Eleanor looked at the group. At their faces, some genuinely remorseful, others just uncomfortable. She thought about holding on to her anger, about telling them to leave and never come back. She had every right to. But she also thought about Tommy watching from the porch, about the life she was building here, about the person she wanted to be going forward. Did she want to be defined by what was done to her, or by how she chose to respond? Keep your money, she said finally. Use it for the school like I told the marshal. But I want one thing from you. Anything, the mayor said quickly. Teach your children better. Teach them that being different isn't the same as being dangerous. That strength in a woman is a gift, not a threat. That justice means listening to all sides, not just the loudest voice. She paused. And teach them that caging someone doesn't make them a monster. It makes monsters of the people who built the cage. The mayor nodded solemnly. We will. I promise you we will. After they left, Eleanor felt lighter somehow. Not forgiven, not healed, but unburdened. She'd set her peace, set her terms. Now she could move forward without the weight of Willow Creek's guilt hanging over her. The weeks that followed were the happiest Eleanor had known since Thomas died. Maybe even happier in some ways. She and Daniel worked side by side, turning the ranch from a neglected property into a functioning homestead. They planted winter wheat, repaired fences, bought cattle with money Daniel had saved. Jim taught Tommy how to rope and ride. Eleanor learned to bake bread in the temperamental wood stove, burning the first 3 loaves before finally getting it right. And at night, after Tommy was asleep, she and Daniel would lie in bed and talk about their pasts, about their dreams for the future, about the small moments of the day that made them laugh or gave them hope. One evening in late November, as the first snow began to fall, Eleanor made an announcement at dinner. I'm pregnant. The room went silent. Tommy's eyes went wide. Jim dropped his fork. Daniel just stared at her. You're sure? He finally managed. I'm sure. About 6 weeks along, I think. A grin spread across Daniel's face so wide it looked like it might split his cheeks. He stood crossed to her side of the table and pulled her into his arms. We're going to have a baby. Tommy jumped up and down. I'm going to be a big brother. I'm going to be the best big brother ever. Jim wiped his eyes with his napkin. "Congratulations, kids. This ranch could use the sound of a baby crying again." That night, as Eleanor lay in bed with Daniel's hand resting gently on her still flat stomach, she felt a peace she'd never imagined possible. She'd gone from a cage to this, from being called a monster to carrying new life. The journey had been brutal, painful, scarring, but she'd survived it, thrived despite it. "What if it's a girl?" she asked softly. Daniel's thumb traced circles on her belly. "Then we teach her to be strong and kind, and never let anyone make her feel like her strength is a flaw." "And if it's a boy?" "Same thing. Strength isn't about gender, it's about character." Eleanor smiled in the darkness. "Thomas would have liked you. Grace would have liked you too. She always said I needed someone who could keep up with me. You're the only person I've ever met who could." They fell asleep like that, tangled together, already dreaming of the child who would come in the spring. But first, there was one more thing Eleanor needed to do, one more piece of the past to lay to rest. On a bright December morning, she asked Daniel to take her to the hill behind the house, the one with the view of the whole valley. Together they carried 2 wooden markers that Daniel had carved during the long evenings. The first marker bore Thomas Brennan's name and the dates of his birth and death. Beneath it, Daniel had carved, "Beloved Husband." You taught her what love could be. The second marker was for Grace Hartley and their daughter Emma. Beneath their names, "Beloved Wife and Daughter, forever in our hearts." They set the markers side by side in the hard ground, working together to make sure they stood straight and true. When they finished, Eleanor placed wildflowers at the base of Thomas's marker, flowers she'd dried and saved from the summer. "Thank you for teaching me to be strong," she said softly, "for making me believe I could be loved just as I was. I hope wherever you are, you're proud of the life I'm building." Daniel knelt before Grace's marker. "I'm sorry I ran for so long. Sorry I wasted 3 years being angry at the world. But I'm home now, and I'm trying to live again. I hope that's enough." Tommy, who'd followed them up the hill, placed a small stone between the 2 markers. "My mama's with them too, right in heaven." Eleanor put her arm around him. "I believe so, and I believe they're all happy that we found each other." They stood there for a long time, the 4 of them, as the wind whispered through the grass and the valley spread out below like a promise. This hill would be their memorial, their way of honoring the past while building the future. As they walked back down to the ranch, Tommy between them holding both their hands, Eleanor looked back one last time. The markers stood silhouetted against the sky, eternal and unchanging. But she was different now, changed by loss and suffering and love, stronger for it, better for it. She thought about the cage one last time, that iron prison that had defined her for 18 months. It was gone now, melted down into something useful, something that would help children learn and grow. In a way, it had been transformed from a symbol of her shame into a symbol of hope. She'd been transformed too, from victim to survivor, from prisoner to wife, from the monster of Willow Creek to Mama Eleanor, who would soon bring new life into the world. At the house, smoke curled from the chimney. Dinner was cooking. The animals were fed. The fences were mended. Everything was ready for winter, ready for the baby, ready for whatever came next. Daniel squeezed her hand. Home. Eleanor squeezed back. Home. And finally, after everything, it was true. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter. The labor was hard, long. There were moments when she thought she might die, when the pain was so intense she couldn't remember why she'd wanted this. But Daniel stayed with her through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, refusing to leave, even when old Jim suggested he might want to wait outside. When the baby finally came squalling and red-faced and perfect, Eleanor held her and wept. Tears of relief, of joy, of gratitude that she'd lived to see this moment. "She's beautiful," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like her mother." They named her Hope. Hope Grace Hartley. A name that honored the past while celebrating the future. Tommy was obsessed with his baby sister from the first moment he saw her. He'd help change her, rock her when she cried, sing to her in a soft, off-key voice that somehow always made her stop fussing. "I'll protect her," he told Eleanor seriously. "No one will ever hurt her. I promise." Eleanor believed him. The ranch prospered. Word spread about the tall woman who could outwork most men and the quiet cowboy who'd bought her freedom. People came from neighboring ranches to meet them to trade to share news. Most were kind. Some were curious. A few were judgmental. Eleanor didn't care. She'd survived worse than whispers. On Hope's first birthday, they threw a party, invited everyone from the valley. Annabelle came from Pine Ridge with her new husband. Marshall Ford stopped by to check on them and ended up staying for cake. Even a few people from Willow Creek made the journey, including Doc Wilson, who apologized again for not speaking up sooner. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of the sheriff, of losing my position. I let that fear make me a coward. I'm sorry." Eleanor accepted his apology. What else could she do? Holding on to anger wouldn't change the past. It would only poison the present. That night, after the guests had left and Hope was asleep in her cradle, Eleanor and Daniel sat on the porch as they had 100 times before. But this time Tommy sat with them. He was 10 now, tall and strong, already taking on more responsibilities around the ranch. "Tell me the story again," he asked, "about how you met." Daniel and Eleanor exchanged a smile. They'd told this story many times, but it never got old. "I rode into a town called Willow Creek," Daniel began. "I was just passing through looking for supplies, but then I saw something that stopped me cold. A cage in the middle of the square, and inside that cage was the bravest woman I'd ever seen. She didn't cry," Tommy added. He knew this part by heart. "Even though people were mean to her." "That's right," Eleanor said. "I'd learned that tears only encouraged them. So I sat still as stone and waited." "And then Papa Daniel bought you." "He did. $500 in gold. More money than I'd ever seen in my life. And then he asked you to marry him. Right there in front of everyone, on his knees in the dirt." Tommy grinned. "And you said yes." "I said yes." "Why?" It was a new question. One Tommy had never asked before. Eleanor thought about it. "Because your Papa Daniel saw me when everyone else looked away. He saw a human being instead of a monster. He gave me a choice when I'd had none, and that made all the difference." Daniel pulled her close. "Best $500 I ever spent." She laughed and kissed him. "Best decision I ever made." Tommy made a face at their affection, but he was smiling. This was his family. Imperfect, scarred, built from broken pieces. But his. Years passed. Hope grew into a strong, curious child who climbed trees and asked endless questions and was afraid of nothing. Tommy grew into a fine young man who ran the ranch with Daniel while Eleanor managed the accounts and the growing herd. They expanded, bought more land, hired hands to help with the work, became prosperous in the way that comes from honest labor and careful planning. Eleanor never forgot the cage. How could she? It had shaped her, changed her, made her into the woman she'd become. But it no longer defined her. She was more than the giant widow now. She was a wife, a mother, a rancher, a woman who'd survived hell and built heaven on the other side. Sometimes late at night when she couldn't sleep, she'd think about the girl she'd been before Thomas died. Shy, uncertain, always trying to make herself smaller to fit into a world that didn't have space for someone like her. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who took up space unapologetically, who used her strength without shame, who'd learned that surviving wasn't the same as living, but that both were necessary. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Daniel took Eleanor back to Pine Ridge, back to the little white church where they'd gotten married. Reverend Cole was older now, more stooped, but his eyes were still kind. Mrs. Cole hugged Eleanor like a daughter. "I knew you'd make it," she said softly. "The moment I saw you, I knew you had the strength to build something beautiful." They renewed their vows, said the same words they'd said a decade before, but this time with the weight of experience behind them, this time knowing exactly what they were promising: to stand together through the hard days, to lift each other up when the weight got too heavy, to choose each other again and again, no matter what. When it was over, and they stood on the church steps looking out at the town, Daniel said, "Any regrets?" Eleanor thought about everything: the cage, the fear, the pain, the long road from victim to survivor to woman who thrived. She thought about Hope's laugh and Tommy's pride and the ranch that bore her sweat and blood. She thought about waking up next to Daniel every morning and knowing she was safe, known, loved. Not a single one, she said, and it was true. 20 years after that day in Willow Creek Square, Eleanor stood on the hill behind her ranch and looked at the markers she and Daniel had placed there so long ago. She was 48 now. Her blonde hair was streaked with gray. Her hands were more scarred and calloused than ever. Her body bore the marks of hard living and hard labor. But she was happy. Hope was 18, engaged to a young rancher from the next valley over, a good man who treated her with respect and wasn't intimidated by her height or her strength. Tommy was married with 2 children of his own, running a spread 20 miles south. Daniel's hair was mostly gray now, his movements slower, but he still woke every morning ready to work. And Eleanor was a grandmother, a ranch owner, a woman whose story had spread throughout the territory, not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to survival, to transformation, to the power of one person seeing another's humanity when everyone else saw a monster. She heard footsteps behind her, Daniel coming to join her as he always did. "You thinking about the old days?" he asked. "Just remembering how far we've come." He put his arm around her waist. "We've had a good life." "Better than good." She leaned into him. "You saved me, you know." "No, I bought you time and space. You saved yourself." Maybe they were both right. As the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Eleanor thought one last time about the cage, about the iron bars and the mocking crowds and the endless days of captivity. That cage was gone now, melted down, transformed, no longer a prison, but a bell that rang every day to call children to school. She'd been transformed too, not melted down, not destroyed, but reshaped by fire and pressure into something stronger, something that could withstand whatever came next. The cage had tried to break her. Instead, it had forged her into steel, and steel once properly tempered could never be broken again.